I'm Laura Suter, Personal Finance Analyst at AJ Bell, and today I'm going to be talking about some of the policy and lobbying work that we're doing at the company this year. There's obviously been a lot of change in government at the moment, and so I thought it might be useful to look back at what's been happening to policy in the interim. So Brexit has delayed a lot of policy, and I'll touch on some of the specific areas later on. But we do have a new government now, and the government appears to want to do stuff beyond Brexit. So we've already had some talk of spending. We had a spending review recently where £13 billion of new money was announced for government departments, and there seems to be a willingness to kind of announce changes and make some moves beyond the Brexit sphere. So we can look back at what Boris pledged to do when he was campaigning to be Prime Minister. So his big kind of headline grabbing move was to increase the higher rate of income tax, so the 40% rate, to increase the point at which that kicks in from £50,000 to £80,000. And so that is a 60% hike. And for the highest earners in that group, that represents £2,500 a year extra in their back pockets. It's also probably worth pointing out that the £80,000 limit that he wants to increase it to is kind of the average salary for MPs. So there might be a certain amount of vested interest in there. One of his other pledges in the personal finance space was to fix the pension taper. So we're now at a point where the pension taper, which is kind of a more techie area of pension tax legislation, is now reaching the front page of newspapers such as the Financial Times, and the impact of that, particularly on doctors and other professions, is being seen. So Boris is focused on this, and he said that he wants to fix the pension tax crisis. He didn't give any specifics of how he would actually do that or any time frame, but it's safe to say that it's probably something on his agenda at some point. And then the final area that he talked about during his campaign was to overhaul stamp duty. So his plan to get the property market moving again and to stimulate it was to scrap stamp duty on all homes worth less than £500,000. We've already got a tax break for first-time buyers where they pay no stamp duty on the first £300,000 of any property worth £500,000 or less. But this would extend that to everyone and also increase that kind of tax-free limit. So that would be a £10,000 saving for first-time buyers and a £15,000 saving for other property buyers. But now I wanted to look at some of the areas that AJ Bell as a company is working on and campaigning on and lobbying on. So these are some of the areas that we're going to go through, from kind of bigger policy stuff like ISA and pension simplification to some of the work that the FCA is doing on vulnerable customers. So if we start with ISA simplification. So our view is that the ISA concept was to have a very simple, easy to understand, tax efficient account that the broad majority of the public could understand. And ISAs have become pretty popular. Around half of UK adults use them, but the majority of people are leaving their money in cash rather than investing it. And we think that if the system was simplified, there would be capacity for more people to understand it, and so therefore more people to use it. So we've put a lot of thought into this, and it's one of our kind of big areas of focus for the year. And we've come up with a plan to cut the current 6 ISAs into 1 ISA. So I'm just going to run through that. We came up with a policy paper which we've issued and which you can find on the AJ Bell website, or you can contact us and we can send it to you. And that lays out these plans in more detail. But if I just run through kind of quickly the outline of what we plan, what we propose. So the stocks and shares ISA would be the basis of the new ISA, and that would be the kind of main account for the new 1 ISA. Within this, we would scrap the Help to Buy ISA. So this is the ISA that incentivizes people, first-time buyers, to get on the property ladder. So it's already coming to an end in November. So from the end of November, you can no longer open a new Help to Buy ISA account. Those with existing accounts can carry on paying into it and getting the government bonus, but no one can open a new account. And because that product is on its way out anyway, we think that as part of simplifying the scheme, we would scrap that. One of the things that we're really keen to do is to ensure that we don't end up with lots of legacy products lying around. So we've come up with a way of rolling those Help to Buy ISA accounts into the existing kind of 1 ISA account, which I can come on to later. So the junior ISA would remain as it is with the same kind of age and withdrawal restrictions, but when the individual turned 18, they would see those restrictions removed, and so they would get that higher annual limit of which is currently £20,000. By doing this, we would simplify the quirk at the moment that means that those between the age of 16 and 18 can benefit effectively from 2 ISA allowances, and we think that it makes more sense for that ISA account to roll over at age 18 into the one ISA, and they have one pot of savings that carries with them throughout their life. One of our more radical suggestions is that we would scrap the innovative finance ISA. So we think that it should be scrapped to protect consumers. We can see that there is space in the market for some of the kind of peer-to-peer lending and investments that you can make within that, but we don't think that it's, if we're creating a one ISA product that's available to the masses and has broad market appeal, we don't think that the innovative finance ISA has a place within that. We think that it's probably the movement of direction from particularly the FCA anyway, who have come out. The chair, Charles Randall, came out recently and said that he's seen some very risky and sometimes fraudulent investments put within these innovative finance ISAs. And we think that there's kind of a push from them to look into the suitability of these products, particularly as part of the collapse of London Capital and Finance. They're reviewing whether the tax incentives on these products are appropriate. And so we think that it's kind of the direction of travel anyway, and we just don't think that it has a place in a kind of product with broad market appeal. And then finally, the cash ISA, we would just be part of the one ISA, but certain ISA managers could choose to restrict the available investments to just cash. So that leaves us with one ISA that we have not yet incorporated into this new model, and that's the lifetime ISA. So it's been a more controversial product since it was launched. We've offered it since launch, but we haven't been shy of being critical of some of the problems with it. But it has been quite popular. So we put in a freedom of information request to the government to find out how many people had actually opened the accounts. And a few months ago, it was around 290,000. So it will have grown since then. And that's broadly in line with what the government expected, which we think is particularly good considering we haven't seen any big banks or building societies launching cash versions of this product. So it shows that there is appetite for it. But we would work out a way, or we have worked out a way of rolling it into the one ISA product, but keeping that incentive. So at the moment, the lifetime ISA, you can pay in up to £4,000 a year, and then the government gives you a 25% bonus on that money, and it is used either for saving for a first home or for retirement. So we would keep that government bonus, but it would just be paid at the point that you exchange on house purchase. So this means that you would get the money when you use it for what the government is incentivizing you for. And the maximum bonus would remain the same at £1,000 a year, or 25% of the total pot. And it would just be counted as each year you paid into that ISA would count as an ISA subscription year, and that would give you an entitlement to that maximum £1,000 bonus per year. So for example, if you had 5 ISA subscription years, then your maximum government bonus available would be £5,000, assuming that met the threshold of it being 25% of the pot that you paid in. And so we would keep that the same, and the age restrictions of 18 to 50 the same, which means the maximum bonus that the government could potentially pay out is £32,000, which is the same as the current system. But by paying the government bonus at the point of exchange on a property, you scrap the exit penalty, which has been one of the most controversial parts of the lifetime ISA, is that if people save money into it and then need to take the money out or want to take the money out for a different reason, they pay an exit penalty, which was the government originally intending to claw back their government bonus, but it ends up being actually a kind of slightly more than 6% tax on the money that you've put in. So by paying the government bonus at the time of exchange, you have no need to claw back that money, and people can take out the money from the RISA if they needed to for another reason. So we think that all of these changes would greatly simplify the ISA system and also would not be too onerous to do. So one of the other areas that we've also been looking at this year is pension simplification. We've obviously been talking about pension simplification for a long time, but we're now in a position where there's going to be less state help for those people retiring in the future, and for those younger people, defined benefit schemes are a thing of the past. So we're at a real point where there's a lot more onus on individuals to save for their retirement. And the World Economic Forum did some research recently, and they found that the average person in the UK will outlive their retirement savings by 10 years. So that's quite a big gap for people to bridge. So they face this choice of either saving more money today or working for longer, or what is the reality for most people will probably be a combination of both. And we think that lots of changing legislation and tax policy around pensions have made them much more complicated. And we think that there's a lot of room for simplification within that. And I also think, as I talked earlier about the fact that the taper has become kind of front page news on a lot of national newspapers, we think that there's real appetite for change to happen and for the system to be simplified. So here are kind of some of the things that we would do to simplify the pensions market. So we would abolish that taper. We think that it's too complicated. Lots of professionals even say that they don't have confidence in advising on it because the calculations involved in it are so tricky for some clients. We would also abolish the money purchase annual allowance. We think that unfairly caught out people who took money from their pensions already in good faith. And it's also not widely understood among the public. And we would abolish the lifetime allowance. But we are conscious that we can't just announce our plans for lots of things and push for lots of things without being aware of the cost associated with them. So in order to limit the cost of abolishing the lifetime allowance, we would say that contributions to pension funds over that £1 million mark shouldn't be allowed. But the investment returns that take you over that limit would not be taxed and would not face the kind of penalty that they do at the moment. By getting rid of the lifetime allowance, we would also remove the need for lifetime allowance tests and the 7 different forms of lifetime allowance protection that exists. But we're conscious that that this would all cost money, and so we would then say that the government could reduce the annual allowance to a point that became more cost neutral for them. And as part of the pension simplification plans that we would like to see, we would also like to see death benefits simplified. So we would like that process to be made smoother and to have a blanket inheritance tax exemption on pension death benefits, which would then remove the provider discretion that's in place. And in reality, this would probably bring the system into the position that lots of clients and pension holders think that it is at the moment, where it goes to their nominated beneficiary. And we think that in a kind of post-pension freedoms world, where everyone is taking more personal responsibility for their own money, that this would be a very simple move to bring this system in line with what a lot of the public think that it is, and make it a much simpler system. So other areas that we expect to see government movement on this year is inheritance tax. So the new Chancellor, Sajid Javid, has said that he is a low tax guy and he's a fan of simplified taxes. I think everyone can acknowledge that IHT is not a simplified tax. So HMRC did their own research looking at people that are gifted money and found that fewer than half actually understood the inheritance tax implications of gifting that money and whether they would be caught out by it. So the government's already commissioned the Office for Tax Simplification to do a review into how to simplify IHT, and it's come back with 2 reports. One is on the administration side of the tax, and the other is on the actual structure of the tax and the gifting rules around it. And I think this this kind of graphic really sums up one of the big problems with inheritance tax. So it shows that there's almost 600,000 deaths in the UK each year, and there are around half that number of IHT forms completed each year, so around 275,000. But of those, just 24,500 actually result in IHT being paid. So you've got all of these people taking this time to fill in the IHT forms, and it's not resulting in them actually having to pay the tax or any revenue for the government. So if we look at the OTS's suggestions first on reforming the gifting allowances. So they were tasked with coming up with a system that was cost neutral. So they were told that they could make changes to simplify, or suggestions to simplify the system, but that it couldn't cost the government a lot more money. So some of these suggestions have to kind of be taken in tandem. Some of them kind of give with one hand and take with the other in order to simplify the system. So one of their big proposals was to scrap the taper, so to cut that 7-year period down to 5. And get rid of the sliding scale that there is at the moment. So they said that that's not widely understood, that kind of ratcheting down of the inheritance tax rate that people see at the moment when they gift. They said it's not widely understood by the public and it's too complicated. So they would get rid of it. They would cut the period down to 5 years, but you would end up with a cliff edge. So if someone gifted money and their estate had to pay IHT, then if they died within 5 years, that full 40% IHT rate would be due. But if they died at 5 years and 1 day, for example, then no IHT would be due on that gift. So it becomes a bit more of a kind of cliff edge and a bit of a blunt tool. We think that the taper could probably be simplified into a 2-step process rather than the kind of longer step process that it is at the moment. Or if you're going to have this cliff edge, then the period should probably be reduced down from 5 years suggested. But one of the good suggestions from the report, we think, was to merge all of the annual gifting allowances into one. So at the moment, we obviously have lots of different gifting allowances, depending on your relationship with the person, whether they're getting married, whether comes under the small gifting rule, and it's all quite complicated and means that the allowances aren't used so much. So the OTS suggested merging all of those into just one annual gifting allowance for an individual each year. But to pay for that, because their assumption is that if you have a simplified gifting system, then more people will make use of it. So to pay for that, they would stop the ability for people to gift money from disposable income. So this is it's not widely known about in the public, but it's potentially very lucrative tax break for wealthy families. So it's the ability to gift a potentially unlimited amount of money as long as you can prove that it's from your disposable income and it's not detrimental to your lifestyle. So it's something that wealthy individuals with large pension or investment income, for example, can definitely make use of. So the OTS suggestion is to scrap this. We think that obviously while it's lucrative, it's used by a very small number of people, and that's probably fair to scrap that to simplify the annual gifting allowance. And then one area that the OTS kind of dodged was the residence nil rate band. So they acknowledged that this kind of newer introduction adds a lot of complexity into the system, but they couldn't find a cost neutral way to solve it. So they said if they scrap it entirely, then there'll be a 70% increase in the number of estates that pay inheritance tax in the next kind of 4 to 5 years. But if they scrap it and roll it into the nil rate band, and so raise the nil rate band to £500,000, then it would cost the government around an extra £8 billion a year in that kind of 4 to 5 year period. So they acknowledge that it's not very simple for people to understand and that there's room for it to be simplified, but couldn't find a cost neutral way to do it. They did say that there could be some tweaks made around the edges in terms of the downsizing rule, which is particularly tricky for lots of people to work out, and on some of the restrictions around when you're eligible to use it, because at the moment it has to be given to direct descendants. So those that don't have children or want to leave it to other family or friends can't make use of it. So then if we look at the administration side of what the OTS looked into, and so this chart shows how long people spend on average looking at IHT forms and filling out the IHT forms if they're not getting professional help or an advisor. So 13% of people took more than 100 hours to fill out the IHT forms, and 90% of people took 10 hours or more. And then if you compare that to the previous graph that shows the number of people that are filling out these IHT forms but don't actually end up paying the tax, we can see that it's kind of a colossal waste of time for a lot of people. So the OTS came up with some very simple suggestions of how to help reform this. They said that there should be a simple online system created to check if IHT is due and to take you through that process. And they estimate that that would stop 250,000 people a year from having to go through the IHT form filling process. But they acknowledge that it will take the government quite a bit of time to implement that, particularly at the moment with a lot of kind of Brexit focus within the government. So in the interim, they said more help and guidance should be provided for individuals. There should be an online tax calculator to help people work out how much they would owe, if anything, and there should be more kind of how-to guides and videos to help guide people through that process so it doesn't take them so long. And so one of the other areas that we expect to see movement on this year, or will see movement on this year, is the pension dashboard. So Amber Rudd, who's now the former Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, announced it as a seismic shift and said that it was a kind of great move for the pensions industry, and we were really positive about it. So it's the ability for people to log in and ultimately see all of their pensions in one place, see valuation information, charging information, for example, and help people engage more with their pensions, and also potentially further down the line look at switching their pensions and consolidating into one pot and making that process easier. So the government pledged that it would launch in 2019, and it's continuing with that, and it's pushing on with that, even though the project probably isn't at the place that lots of people would have hoped it would be by now. So I spoke at the start about some projects that have been delayed because of Brexit, and this is definitely one that has faced potentially a lack of attention because the government has been sidetracked with Brexit. But they pledged to launch it this year, and they will do, but it's likely that the first launch will be kind of beta testing to a very small number of users, and it will be a much more simplified system. So the kind of image on this chart here on this slide shows that the ultimate position that the DWP wanted to get to, with valuation information and forecast and state pension information in there, that is not likely to be the position we get to for quite a while. We've also in a position now where we've moved from pension dashboard singular to pension dashboards plural, because the government now wants more providers to offer pension dashboards. But until we have information on the data standards required, whether HMRC will be providing state pension and national insurance information, and the regulatory framework from the FCA, it's unlikely that anyone's going to launch until we've got those pieces of information. So we don't want to be too doom and gloom about this. We think that we'll still ultimately get to the position that we thought we would be, with the kind of all singing, all dancing pension dashboards, but it's just going to take a bit longer to get there. And then the final area that I wanted to touch on is vulnerable customers. So this is a focus from the FCA this year, and they want to see that firms are doing more to embed kind of processes in dealing with vulnerable customers. But there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to it, because how companies deal with this depends greatly on the type of financial services company that they are. But I think what the FCA just wants to see that the companies have considered this, that they've got processes in place, and that they're working out how to deal with these individuals. And the FCA did some research and found that half of the UK population is potentially vulnerable. And I think this is often surprising to people, because you tend to think of vulnerable customers as those that are going through kind of major trauma in their life, or have severe mental or physical health problems. But actually it can be much smaller things. So for example, people going through a divorce or people going through other big life change can mean that they're potentially vulnerable. And so the FCA wants firms to kind of improve their processes with this, and they focus on 4 areas of vulnerability: so health, life events, resilience, and capability. And the FCA just wants to see a bit more consistency across the industry. So I thought it might be useful to run through a bit of what AJ Bell does, just so you can see some examples of how we've kind of embedded vulnerable customers within our processes. So all staff at the company are trained on vulnerable customers, not just customer facing staff, every single person in the business is. And they're trained on things like spotting potentially vulnerable customers, how to spot the signs of it, how to deal with that customer once they've been identified. And then we have experts within the business that are specifically trained to deal with vulnerable customers. Once a customer has been identified as potentially vulnerable, their account will be flagged. So they should always be dealt with by one of those experts. And when people are speaking to them, they'll be aware that they are potentially vulnerable. We also automatically flag some customer accounts as potentially vulnerable when they're going through one of those kind of life changes that I talked about earlier that we can clearly identify. So those that are in receipt of death benefits, for example, will presumably have someone close to them who has recently died. So they are flagged as being potentially vulnerable. And also when junior SIP or junior ISA accounts are converted into the adult versions, they are automatically flagged as potentially vulnerable as well. But we also have a prompt for customers and for advisors to update us about either their own or their clients' information, to contact us if they have current circumstances that might make them potentially vulnerable or might mean that they need kind of treating with extra care. So that is everything from me. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, then do get in touch with us and we will endeavour to answer them.